pleasure to be here, and a special honor and privilege to talk to one of my favorite authors. Let's start with the writing. Let's start with your life, a special kind of life. As I'm myself immigrant, I've been very curious about Masha in many ways as an immigrant can be. Masha Gessen has written 7 books. She's very, very active as a journalist. You might have read her even in our papers. She writes for a lot of great papers like New York Times, New Yorker, and Guardian, and many, many others. We can read her currently all the time. But we start with your writing, Masha, way before. Just to mention, these 7 books of yours were published with great success and attention in the West, but only one of them is published in Russia. Why don't we start there? And then I would like you to tell us the story behind your emigration from Russia in the 80s and your emigration, your trip back. I mean, it was not just a trip. You came back actually and stayed on for 20 more years, which is kind of back to sender as well. So we start with the story. Why did you return, and how you did become a journalist?
So my family left the Soviet Union in 1981 when I was 14, and we were among hundreds of thousands, well, a little more than 100,000 Soviet Jews who left the country because of anti-Semitism. And my parents' goal was really to get their kids out of the country to make sure that we had an opportunity to get higher education and to get jobs, and that we didn't hit the glass ceiling that they hit very early in their lives. To their credit, unlike many other Soviet Jewish refugees, they never actually came out and said, "We did this for you." They always acted like they did it for themselves. And I think that's part of what allowed me to go back and do it again on my own. And I knew from the beginning, or I thought from the beginning, that part of the reason I was going back was to make the decision to leave.
Yourself, your
Myself,
own decision.
because you know, when you're 14, you don't like your parents making decisions for you.
Of course.
And then it actually turned out to be a wonderful life. I mean, I was already a journalist in the U.S. when I went back to Russia. I went back for the first time to do a story. I wasn't planning to stay, and I was completely ambushed by what it felt like to.
What was it like?
Be in Moscow.
What made you make this decision to stay on?
Well, there's the simple answer. The simple answer is that it was the most interesting story in the world. The first time I went back to the Soviet Union was in March 1991. It was a place of incredible possibility. People were talking about everything that's important in a country and in the world, and what should the relationship between the individual and the state be, and how should we write the constitution, and how should we govern. And it was an amazing place to be as a human being. It was also an incredible place to be a journalist, because there were all these stories that no one had written before. And for a young reporter, it was just endless possibility. And I couldn't imagine, I was very aware of this, that if I had a job at an American newspaper back in the States, every story I did would be building on previous stories done in the same place, on the same topic, with many of the same people speaking. And in Russia, every story was new. Every speaker was new. A lot of the language was new. So it was an incredible place to be. So that's the simple answer.
What's the other one? Give it to us now.
The harder thing to explain is that it felt like home. And And it wasn't that I didn't feel at home in New York. I love New York, but I felt like everything about it, the way the sky looked, the way the light fell, the way my body felt in space, it's like I fit back into a puzzle. And it's an incredibly seductive feeling.
It's interesting because I'm sorry to refer to myself, but as I left Poland at 17 years old with a lot of traumatic experiences, it took me almost 30 years to come back. I couldn't even imagine to go back. It was terrible. Just think of the fact that somebody, one person in the street would spot me in the face was so reluctant and I was so afraid how I would react, and I just couldn't imagine to go back. But for you, your experiences as a 14 years old were not that bad, or it was really also about the family you had there. You felt home there, but did you have time to feel home enough in US? I mean, it was school, and it was you were a teenager.
I had
as any teenager.
Definitely, I had a community there. I felt very comfortable, and I think that's what made it difficult for me to explain to people in Russia what I was doing there, because they'd say, "So it didn't work out for you in America, did it?" No, actually, I was. By the time I was 21, I was the editor of a magazine. It worked out very well.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, but there was something else.
It was a challenge, and it was a different kind of interesting atmosphere there. Yeah.
Yes, and and it was something I hadn't experienced, and I think. I'm glad you referred to yourself, because I think that difference in 3 years is actually really important. But also, your story was different. You were in a position to sort of take part in the decision, and I think you were part of the driving force.
Maybe even.
But whereas my parents had made the decision when I was 11. And they were waiting. I had spent 3 years knowing that they had made this decision for me.
Okay, I get it. Okay, we leave it for a moment. But you come back to Moscow. You start your journalistic career there, writing quite a lot for American papers as well. And then you start to write in Russian. Was it that hard?
Oh, that was very hard, because. I'm like a linguistic spy, because I pass for Russian. I have no accent when I speak Russian. But of course, I'd left school when I was 14, so I couldn't write in Russian, not on a professional level. Whereas in English, I write like a native, but I don't sound like a native to Americans. So when I was, fortunately, I come from a family of writers and editors. So when I first got the idea that I wanted to be a Russian language journalist in addition to being an American journalist, and this was in the mid-90s, and I was already living in Moscow, I would take my stories to my grandmother's or my aunt's to edit before submitting them to the editors. Okay. So the editors didn't know I wrote with an accent. and then gradually I stopped having the accent.
Yeah. And how was it then? I mean, we started writing journalist. How free how free were you? Was it possible to act for you? I mean, the editors, and we know how, more or less, how Russia was. How was it like? But more or less, because it has been changing enormously. Could you tell us something about the changes when you started write as a journalist, and what happened then?
Oh, I think I'm very lucky to be the age that I am, because the younger generation of journalists has no memory of the 1990s and what a heady time it was to be a journalist. It was a difficult time to be a lot of things, and it was a difficult time to be living in Russia. But for my generation, it was just a decade of endless opportunity. And for journalists, it was so exciting. We're inventing magazines, we're inventing genres, it's like no one had been there before. And I was, in 96, I was part of starting a new weekly magazine in cooperation with Newsweek in the States, and the magazine in Moscow was called Itogi, and I worked there for 5 years. I very quickly became the chief correspondent for the magazine. So I ran the actual on-the-ground reporting operations of the magazine. It was really fun, and I got to travel all over Russia. So I spent
And how
most of
about
my time on the road.
censorship then?
None. I mean, there was
censorship.
I mean, it's well known that that the media in Russia were owned by the oligarchs.
Yeah.
And in the late 1990s, Russia was indeed an oligarchy. I think that term is often misused now, but in the late 1990s, there was a small group of men who had money and political power that stemmed from that money.
Yeah.
And part of that political power was the media. But the huge difference between that kind of system and what we have now in Russia is that it was transparent. I mean, if they were fighting over, whether they were trying to split up a factory or a network, you could see them doing it. And they did try sometimes abuse the media to that end, but it was still transparent. It was a very crude but obvious kind of freedom of speech. And certainly I don't feel I ever faced any censorship.
But it went very fast for you. You became a very well-known journalist. You had this one magazine after another. What happened? When did this happen, when you really could see that things were changing in the wrong way?
Oh, I saw it from the very beginning. It was an accident, but I saw it right when it started. Because in the late 1990s, I was reporting a lot from St. Petersburg. And I had, there were many stories I wrote, and there was also one story that I didn't write, because I couldn't figure the story out. There was a man who was in St. Petersburg who was in jail, had been in jail for a couple of years by the time I started collecting information on him. He had owned a small television channel, and somehow he had been jailed. I couldn't figure out the story, so I just collected all these documents. And then in May 2000, the owner of the media holding to which my magazine belonged was arrested. And he was arrested because he had opposed Putin's election. And so Putin was going to take the media holding away from him. But they also needed a formal reason to arrest him. And so he was arrested in connection with this case. I just so happened to have a box of files on this case. It was a complete coincidence. But I could see how it was working. Suddenly I could see how that case had been manufactured, who'd been involved in it. I could see Putin's fingerprints all over it, I mean his signature on documents. And I could see why the owner of my media holding was arrested in connection with this case. So I wrote a big story about it. And the owner of the media holding, Vladimir Gusinsky, he went into exile, and I stayed in Moscow. And I was the one who had written the story, so I immediately started getting death threats, and there was somebody standing outside my apartment door, and my telephone line was cut, and all sorts of things happened that had been familiar to people in the 70s and have since become familiar to people. It was a very scary few weeks. I left the country for a little bit. I came back.
When was that exactly?
This was summer 2000.
Summer 2000.
And from that point on, I knew how it was working. It was a very clear message. It was delivered right to my doorstep.
Exactly. We are as we are at your doorstep. We have to mention it with a few words. Now, you might have heard it before, but we even mentioned it yesterday when Masha was talking to Björn Wiman. But Masha is now living with her family, the 3 children and her partner in New York, and the reason is the reason for the living of Moscow was that this anti-gay law was about to be introduced in Moscow, meaning, I don't know if I'm simplifying things, but more or less meaning that anything can happen, that the children can be taken away from you any moment. So that was kind of a limit where you came after quite a long period, because now we are talking about 2012. It was December 12th.
2013, yeah.
2000.
Yes, I've been there for
Yes, right.
20 years.
Yes. So, but this period from starting 2000 until 2013 was getting worse and worse in many ways. So you were in the position when it started 2000, you felt the threats, you got them. We have to ask how you handled them and how you lived with them for such a long time. I mean, there were children in your family, the friends and so on, the family, the rest of the family. You have a lot of family members still in Moscow. Could you describe it to us? Because this is very interesting to hear about. Well,
the thing about living with risk, it's obviously not fun, and it's difficult. I like risk, right? I'm a reporter, and I'd been a war reporter in the 90s, and a lot of war correspondents get addicted to the risk of going to war, and I think part of what's addictive about it is that you have agency. You go in. It's really scary and dangerous, and then you leave. The problem with being threatened in your home is that you can't exactly leave unless you leave everything. So it's distinctly more unpleasant than being a war correspondent. But it's not like I felt under constant threat. There were periods when I was being threatened, and then there were periods when I felt like I was living very well. And part of what's kept Putin in power for so long is that he has accidentally presided over a period of unprecedented prosperity in Russia. But that also meant for the professional classes, it also meant we're living very well. We're living very well materially, and there were many weird opportunities, like political journalism became extremely difficult. But glossy magazines or other thick magazines, like I was editor of a popular science magazine that was doing extremely well because people had leisure and people had money to spend on good magazines, on an advertising in good magazines, and that sort of thing. So there was a weird dissonance, and I don't want to make it sound like it was all dark times and really scary, because in fact then you really won't be able to understand why I stayed there for so long or how people stay there and how people function. But it's a weird contrast between extreme danger and good times.
But you did develop some strategies, everyday strategies.
Yes.
Of course, I asked, you had guards? No.
No.
The answer is no, for a special reason. That the guards are very often the ones responsible of things.
No, that's not the reason, actually. The reason is that I couldn't imagine, like at one point, when I was a bureau chief, I had a driver, and I found that incredibly constraining and inconvenient. I don't like to be tied to someone. And also, the special reason why I never had a bodyguard, unlike many other people, is that I like to go everywhere by bicycle. And I couldn't imagine how it was going to work.
Bodyguard. Oh, interesting.
But no, I mean, the strategies I developed, my biggest strategy, and I think it's the most important one, was to air my head out every so often. So twice, I actually left the country for an academic year. We went to the States on fellowships. But also, even when I was in the country for years at a time, I would leave the country at least once every couple of months and talk to other people and be in a saner place. Because I think that what's really underestimated is how insane living in a repressive environment makes you, how your perceptions of things get shifted, how difficult it is to feel grounded and to do good work. And then, if you're a writer and you're doing bad work, you feel it and you feel horrible.
Yeah. Talking of going out, we were mentioning it before, talking about what we could do in the West, what would be good for all these journalists risking their lives every day, but not being known outside the country. That was one of the. You think this is one of the most important parts of what we in the West could do, is that it not only to help people come out of the country in order to get another perspective and to see their own lives from outside, but also to get themselves known in the West, so their names are printed, their names are known. And we were talking a little bit about yesterday that we might maybe try to arrange something. I couldn't sleep this night, so thinking about what we could do, and I'm sure we can do something like starting a movement, arranging the cooperation between the big papers in the world, the big papers, when we could try to have an idea that these unknown voices, the unknown but threatened people appear and write, and maybe helped by people like you, maybe introduced by Masha Gessen and Svetlana Alexeyevich and a few other people who are well known outside Russia. When I saw how fantastically these big papers were cooperating when Charlie Hebdo happened, all of a sudden it was possible. But the situation in Russia, we are so used to kind of to hear that about these journalists being threatened that we don't react to it. But in fact, we can do things for them, and I'm going to try to do something about it, and at least find a few people who can see a way how we could do it in a systematic way. I mean, we could maybe. I'm not a journalist, but maybe that a couple of times a month they could be read. I think it would be good for us to get this information about what's going on there. It would be great for them, and that would be another reason for them to come out of the country. So I had a lot of thoughts about that, and if there are any journalists here, please join me and try to figure out and find out the key people in Sweden, in Scandinavia, and then why not in Europe. And you have very good contact with a few papers in US, so maybe we can do something about that. But now back to your books. I mean, you've been writing.
But can I add a little bit more to that?
Sure, yeah. Please.
So what? If you go on the website of, say, Reporters Without Borders or the Committee to Protect Journalists, the organizations that document attacks on journalists, and you look at the list of attacks in Russia, what you will see is that you have never heard of most of the people who are getting attacked or murdered. And that's one of the reasons they're getting attacked or murdered, right? Because someone like me, who's widely published in the West, is at a much lesser risk than someone that the West has never heard of, because there's nothing at stake for their attackers. So what we were talking about was making people who are doing the work on the ground, who really are at daily risk, lowering the risk for them just a little bit by making them a little bit better known in the West.
Let's think more about it and talk more about it, of course. Now, I mentioned that you have written 7 books, and only one of them is is published in Russia, which has to be sad to think of, really. I won't mention about all the books, but the most famous one is the Putin book, which was published here a few years ago. We don't have it here on the table because I have a feeling that it's sold out. Maybe there are a few more copies up there. But and the last book, the latest book you have written, no, it's not the latest. The latest in Swedish is a book of on Pussy Riot group, which we published 1 year ago. And the latest book you have written is about the brothers who were who were responsible of marathon bombing in Boston. Not published here, but published with a lot of interesting reactions in this year, in May. But there are other books you have written. One of the favorite ones I'm in love with. It's a book on your grandmothers. It's a book about Russia as well, not only about your grandmothers. Very, very well written, and it's your story too, of course. Very gripping story, Ruja and Esther. And it's not published in Russia. Now and the rest, of course, the Putin book we can come back to. But let's start by a simple question: why not? I mean, anti-Putin book I can see, but a story of your grandmother's. Why? What's the reason there is nobody willing to publish it?
Well, actually, I just signed a contract to have it translated into Russian. But it's absurd. The book is more than 10 years old, and it's about Russia. And you would think that, considering that my name is pretty well known, that someone would have picked it up. I think that a big part of the reason is the subtitle of the book. The subtitle is How My Grandmothers Survived Hitler's War and Stalin's Peace.
And that's enough. This subtitle is...
You can hear how I draw a parallel between Hitler and Stalin in the subtitle. And that is enough to get people's guard up in Russia. Because, of course, the worst thing you can do is draw a parallel between Hitler and Stalin. It's the most threatening concept to the sort of entire historical mythology that's at the basis of the Putin regime. And another reason is my reputation for being rather disagreeable, so everybody knows I'm not going to change the subtitles. But we were talking about this a little bit privately last night, that there's a new kind of censorship in Russia, and it's the mechanics of it, I think, are really interesting and important to understand, because it's not the way it used to work in the Soviet Union. Is that every publishing house, every newspaper had a censor sitting there, right? The censor didn't work for the newspaper, the censor worked for the censorship bureau, the Glavlit, and so, or Goskommissariat, depending on the publication. Anyway, so everything that was written had to go to the censor before it was published. It was classic prior censorship. Now that doesn't happen. So you would think that means there's no prior censorship. But there's a media authority that has been putting a lot of restrictions on publishing houses and periodicals using two different laws: the law on the protection of children from harmful information and the law on extremism. So anything can be considered extremist, right? So a publisher, knowing that they might publish a book, and then the media authority, the communications authority, will look at the book and say that it violates the law on extremism, faces huge losses, because then the entire press run will have to be taken off the shelves and pulped. So nobody wants to take a loss. So it makes sense to go to the communications authority ahead of time and ask them if this book can be published. So what you have is not formal prior censorship, but informal prior censorship that's profit-driven. And of course, it's profit-driven for the publishers. It's also profit-driven for the lawyers, because now there's a specialty for lawyers who take the manuscripts to the communications authority and negotiate with them. What if we cut this out? What if we black this out? So it's profit-based censorship, and the levers applied are profit, not strict repression.
So how does it work in time? I mean, if I'm a Russian publisher and I signed you up for this book, what do I do? When do I go to this censorship? Who is not a censor?
Before you print, and you
just before the printing, or when you are ready with the manuscript?
No, when I'm ready with the manuscript, perhaps you typeset it first. Mm-hmm. And you take it to the communications authority. So an example, there's a wonderful young journalist named Yelena Kostyuchenko, very enterprising, great reporter. So a publishing house called AST, which is one of the big conglomerates, had a book of her journalism by Nadia Tolokonnikova from Pussy Riot. And they thought this is obviously risky. So they had their lawyer go to the communications authority with the entire book as it was typeset. And then the communications authority said, fine, the introduction is fine, the book is fine. The only thing that is not fine, that we think is extremist, is Kostyuchenko's report on the trial of Pussy Riot. Which is one of the most bizarre trials, most scary trials, and you can read about it in the book, that I have ever heard about. A friend of mine said to me, after I read your book, my opinion of Kafka was lowered because I realized he didn't make anything up. They were told they couldn't include that in the book. So they actually published the book. I love them for this. They published the book with those pages blank. They didn't reset it. They just took it out, and they wrote political censorship on those blank pages.
They did?
They did.
They were allowed to?
Yeah. Yes. It's a real cat and mouse game. So they wrote political censorship, and then they uploaded that particular chapter to a website, and they included the address for the website in the book.
Yeah. So, talking of strategies.
But of course, that story is extraordinary because the editor of that particular imprint, and he is the same guy who is going to publish Esther and Ruse, he wants to play cat and mouse. He wants to show up what's going on there. Most editors don't want to do that. Most editors just want to be left alone, to publish the safe books, to take precautions, and then, that's when it becomes classic self-censorship. Because they would rather run ahead of the game so that they never have to get into tricky situations.
So if Brombergs would exist in Russia, I don't remember how, I don't understand how that would work exactly. I mean, when the process of making the decision, these are the titles I'm going to publish, and then one by one, I would be sending the manuscripts and waiting kind of 1 month, 6 months. I remember my father was a publisher, so he always liked to talk about the fact that at that time it was communistic Poland. It was they were waiting 1 year for the censorship to come back. He was a publisher of scientific books, so it could be a book on mathematics or physics, but still they were taking forever. And how do they have time for it? Do you realize how many books are published and how many decisions they have to make? If they, especially, and then you mentioned children books there as well, which are probably completely under censorship. I mean, yeah.
That's a really good point, because that's obviously, by making the process bureaucratic and lengthy, you also control publishing. You just lessen, you make the field smaller. It's been especially difficult for children's books publishers because they are actually subjected to prior censorship. It's not called prior censorship, but for every children's book, they have to get an age certificate. So they actually have to take the manuscript to the particular authority and wait for that authority to say, okay, well, there's the mention of a fight in this book, so no child under 12 should be allowed to read it.
So would they publish P.P. Långström now?
That's a great question. I wonder about that. I mean, this is another thing. If you want to run a totalitarian country, or a country that is tending to totalitarianism, you should never have laws that will be evenly applied. Every law has to be applied randomly and selectively. So if you read the law on the protection of children from harmful information, it outlaws the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, everything, because it says that children should not be allowed to read about violence, death, sex, anything else? No, what? War. Yes,
war.
Thank you.
No war.
That's a child over there. That's my daughter, who knows the situation very well. So most things are illegal. And then obviously you have selective enforcement, you have favoritism, you have ample opportunity for corruption, because you can bribe people to issue your age certificate. But the biggest thing that happens is that you just have many fewer books coming out.
That's what I wanted to ask.
It's such a lengthy and complicated and expensive process.
Yeah. So the situation, we have to round up soon, but the situation today, if you compare it today to 5 years ago and 10 years ago, where are we heading? I mean, less books being published, more censorship. I mean, all these censors, there were plenty of them in the 70s. It was a whole profession and millions of people kind of working with it, and then they disappeared for a while, and now they are kind of coming back or getting more and more. How do you see what's happening in the publishing world and in the world of words of all kind?
Well, if you're asking where we're headed to the Dark Ages. So one thing that has happened in the last 5 or 6 years is that most bookstores around the country have closed, or they sell solely stationery and trinkets. And I know this is a worldwide trend. It's extreme in Russia. Right? A couple of publishers have figured out that they're better off selling their books directly. So it's a person-to-person network. So, for example, a children's publisher has resellers who are basically mothers in different cities who order books and then they resell them to other mothers, and they have reading groups. It's a wonderful system. It's great for the mothers. It's great for the publishers because they get cash for the books and they don't get remainders. But it's also an informal way of pushing it underground, of making it, of destroying formal relationships, and destroying the relation between the publisher and the state, because I don't know what happens to taxes when they're getting cash for books, right? So it's a semi-spontaneous process of returning to the Soviet era of samizdat and underground distribution.
It sounds like a samizdat era, yeah. So less publishers means, of course, less books and less big problems with distribution, as you say.
Huge problem with distribution, yeah. And then, with all those measures, you narrow it down enough that it's just the intelligentsia reading a few books. And if it's just the intelligentsia reading a few books, you don't have to bother with it so much, because that's pretty much the situation that we had in the 70s.
It's very sad, because there is also some kind of feeling that there are not enough books, that there are not enough readers, and there is no sense of of willing to read. I mean, we were talking briefly the other day about who this new Russian person is, this new Homo Sovieticus. Who is this person? And you told me a fascinating thing about the survey having been done in Russia, and what people actually said they wanted to be. I mean, could you mention it to us, because it's so interesting?
We were discussing the book that I'm working on now, which is a new book about Russia, but part of what I'm writing about is a long series of surveys that have been conducted over the last quarter century, called Homo Sovieticus. It's an effort to study sort of the impact, the formation of the new person during the Soviet period, and what's happened to that person since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of the characteristics of Homo Sovieticus is plain and simple, right? So the people describe themselves as plain and simple, and that sounds like a positive characteristic to them, but it also means an aggressive rejection of everything complicated, anything that's too smart, anybody who's different, which is why the anti-gay campaign has been so effective, why xenophobia is so extreme.
And why I mention it is because it's not the dream of being an intellectual, going to university, getting more knowledge, reading more books, being more informed. It's just the opposite, plain and simple. That's what people want to be. That's what people see as an interest, as a way of becoming. This is what they want to be. I don't know what the answer in Sweden would be, but that we can discuss more. Anyway, we have to stop. Maybe we have time for 2 questions, if there are any. Please. Kommer du hjälpa? Vi kan. Om du reser dig, bara ställer frågan som det är högt. Yes.
And too little time talking about the actual resistance and to fight against that regime in Russia. And I think it's very interesting what you said now about the underground children's book market. And I'm very interested in knowing, in such a repressive state, who are the people that are resisting and what are the strategies, especially with the LGBT movement?
Yeah.
How can we resist?
We repeat. The question is about resistance, what kind of resistance there is, and how people act about it with the books and with the written word.
Well, unfortunately, in an environment like Russia today, resistance and survival become almost equivalent. So the LGBT movement its only goal is to survive as a movement and as a community. And I'm not even sure that goal is realistic. And I think that's, I wouldn't call the underground or the informal children's book market a form of resistance. It's a form of survival. These mothers are not buying and selling these books because they want to resist the regime. They want to have something to read to their children at bedtime. And instead of going to the store and simply buying a book and then buying a new one, they have to go through these ridiculous contortions.
So it's the books they are buying are better books. I mean, not propaganda ones as well. Another question, the last one, if there is any. Here we are.
I mean, in Sweden we're talking about that people are reading less and less. How is it in Russia?
Yes, so the question is, in Sweden there's talk that of people reading less and less. How is it in Russia? I don't know how much people are reading. I know that bookstores have closed all over the country. I know that publishers are publishing less and it's very difficult to separate sort of economic reasons, which are also political reasons, and the kind of the conversations that people have about demand for books all over the world, but they take on a different quality, not just a different quantity in Russia, because the demand is also being shaped by the propaganda and by the fact that it's so much more difficult to produce a book, or especially an interesting and unusual book, than it is in another country.
I think we stop here. Thanks, Masha. And I just want to tell you how happy I am to have you, how enormously happy I am to be your publisher. And then if you write books, you can count that I'm going to publish them maybe 20, 30 years to come, ever. Okay. Every word you write will be published in this country, so that's for sure.
Thank you, Dorotea.
And you are so welcome.
It's lovely to have you as a publisher. It really is.